Thank you, Tiffany. All right. I've only got one matter, I think, before we turn to witnesses. Just a request of council, just so that we're absolutely clear, I guess, on the extent of the high density zone, which was a wee bit confusing in terms of the map that we've got. I wonder if you can maybe using the map that's at the end of Mr. Liggett's evidence, which shows the notified extent and KO's current position with respect to its extent. Maybe if you could use that map and overlay where council's currently sitting on the extended extent, i.e. the overlap areas, which I think we know where it is, but I think his map is slightly clearer than the one that we've got. You may have an even clearer one for all I know. It's on page 18 of Mr. Liggett's evidence. It's I think a more useful map. But if you could just provide us with a graphic that actually shows precisely where your current extent of the southern extent is, that would be very helpful. Yeah. So ideally it would have, I guess, 3 colours, wouldn't it? Or maybe 3 colours. So one obviously the PC9 notified, second KO's final position, and then the colour where council is currently proposing the southern extent be.
And just to clarify, the extent that I support is the notified extent.
Right.
I think possibly in the maps that you have, it might show the operative extent of the medium or the high density residential zone. That might be
the confusion.
Things slightly.
So council's position hasn't moved from the notified.
No.
Well, that wasn't clear to either. So that's useful for us to have that conversation.
But
right. Well, no, I mean, if that's the case, then Mr. Liggett's chart is it is the existing positions.
That is right. Yes.
That is really good to know.
I think the reason for the detail of this one is it endeavours to show the previous extent of the rest too in the operative plan.
Someone who puts labels on map needs to be given a plain English course, but that might then help. Yes, right. Okay. Well, we've been suffering under that illusion for the past. That's apparently the operatives. Anyway, let's not worry about what the operative says or anything else. We now know where you're at. So that is fortuitous in more than one sense. Right. Okay. I'll leave that dangling. Right. Okay. Was there anything else? Anything from you? Right. And this afternoon we're intending just to go, because of what we heard late on Thursday, we're just going to go and have a look at that area around Rotorua Marae, again, just for context. But we haven't identified from the submissions that we received last week any additional areas that we need to go and visit. So I don't know if any have popped into council's minds. No. So, yeah. And I don't think we're going to hear anything more today from what I gather, from what I've pre-read anyway, that requires us to go anywhere else, but we'll see. All right, so we'll turn to council. Thank you. And yes. Thank you, Ms. Fegre, and I've already expressed my hope that your health is significantly improved. Yes. We do, thank you. We weren't sure it was a summary statement. Yes, right. Another plain English issue. Righto.
Good morning, everyone. And I'd firstly like to say thank you very much to the panel for allowing me the time to recover and appear today rather than when I was ill last week. So yeah, apologies, and thank you very much for that.
No, don't apologise for illness. That just happens. And we are now live, by the way. So yeah, there are others who'd be interested in what you're saying apart from us. So.
Okay, thank you. I've prepared a summary statement. I'd like to know, would you like me to read through there's two parts to it. There's a part where I first of all cover my primary and rebuttal evidence, and then there's the section where I cover where it's mainly focused towards the responses to some of the issues that have come up. Would you like me to cover the first part as well as the second part, or just the second part? Okay, thank you. So my name is Susan Fairgray, and I am an Associate Director at Market Economics. I have worked there as an urban economist for the past 7 years, and prior to this was Senior Research Economist at Auckland Council. I have a BSc and MSc in Geography, specialising in economic geography and including urban economics. I have undertaken detailed assessment of housing demand and supply potential in Rotorua District over the last 4 years. So this work has involved analysis of the land and property base, examination of housing demand by segment of the market, modelling of demand and housing development feasibility across a broad range of market conditions. It has involved ongoing discussion and liaison with Council and consideration of these matters in relation to the NPSUD as well as the Resource Management Amendment Act. I undertook the NPSUD housing capacity and demand assessments for the Rotorua 2021 HBA. So this study calculated the capacity under the operative district plan together with the 2018 spatial plan growth areas in the long term. It included plan-enabled capacity, commercially feasible capacity, infrastructure served capacity, and reasonably expected to be realised capacity. And it also projected the demand for dwellings by location and type. My work in relation to Plan Change 9 has been able to draw on and further extend the analytical and modelling capabilities developed for the 2021 HBA work. It examines the substantial changes in development patterns that have been enabled through the introduction of the MDRS intensification provisions within the Rotorua local economy. It has been further refined in subsequent work to inform the FDS, which also includes modelling the feasibility of capacity. So I have modelled the plan-enabled capacity within a range of potential options to inform Plan Change 9. So these include a baseline scenario of the operative district plan provisions, the application of the medium density residential standards to the ODP zones, and then the capacity enabled by 4 different scenarios, which in my primary evidence are labelled as options 1 to 4, of the combinations of new zones applied in Plan Change 9. So the application of MDRS to the operative zones would enable medium density development across the urban residential area. So to clarify, within the residential 1 zone, this would enable up to 3 dwellings on each 450 square metre site. More intensive medium density development, which was modelled at up to 3 dwellings per 300 square metre site, is enabled across the extent of the urban residential area within options 1 to 4. Options 2 to 4 also include the provision for higher density development. So the spatial extent of the higher density provision forms the key differences between these modelled options. The high density zone in option 2 reflects the extent of the zone notified under Plan Change 9, and options 3 and 4, which I've also tested, contain a significantly expanded area of higher density provision, which covers a large share of Rotorua's inner residential suburban area between Old Topol Road and Fenton Street.
Can I just pause you there and just confirm? Townhouses, did you split townhouses between the 3x3 and the higher density, or did you allocate those entirely to the high density?
So within townhouses, they are modelled across the urban extent. So there's various different dwelling typologies that have modelled in each parcel. So within the residential 1 zone, outside of the high density zone, they would fall into the attached category. So the key difference between that and the high density zone is height. And so the additional typology that I modelled within the high density zone is vertically stacked apartments. So just to be absolutely clear, within the high density zone, I haven't just modelled high density, I haven't just modelled vertically stacked apartments. I've also modelled townhouses there as well as smaller details.
That's what I thought. That's fine. All right.
Yeah. But so just to further clarify, the plan enabled capacity does tend to reflect the vertically stacked apartments because they had the higher yield. The further modelling under the FDS would reflect a range of that depending upon the feasibility. So my assessments have found that Plan Change 9, option 2, would substantially increase the plan enabled capacity within Rotorua's existing urban area relative to the operative district plan baseline provisions. It would enable capacity for an additional 129,500 dwellings, so that's a net additional to the existing dwelling stock, within Rotorua's urban area, which is over 5 times the estimated capacity enabled by the baseline operative provisions. And I'd just like to clarify within that assessment, the modelling that I've undertaken for Plan Change 9 covers the existing urban area, which includes the larger areas of underutilised urban land, but it doesn't cover the greenfield areas beyond that. So the Plan Change 9 modelled option.
Sorry, just again, just to be absolutely clear. So that doesn't include, I guess, those sort of future urban areas.
Correct. The modelling that I undertook for the FDS does. Yeah. So the Plan Change 9 modelled options enable large increases in capacity and development opportunity across the general suburban area, across both detached and attached dwellings, and at similar levels across all options. The modelled capacity for higher density dwellings, so that's the vertically stacked apartments, accounts for the differences in capacity between the modelled options. So apartment capacity ranges from 11,500 dwellings within option 1 to more than 60,000 dwellings under an expanded higher density area under options 3 and 4. So the notified high density zone in option 2 has a capacity for 25,200 additional dwellings, of around which 14,700 of those vertically stacked apartments occur within the high density residential zone area, with the balance occurring within the commercial centres. And I note that the modelling has not captured the further enabled dwelling capacity from notified Plan Change 9 increased building heights from the operative provisions within the commercial centres. These were not determined at the time of the assessment. So there would be further capacity above what's modelled in the plan enabled capacity in my assessment within the commercial centres.
Have you got a ballpark on that extra? I mean, just as a percentage? I mean,
No.
Do we just prorata the additional stories?
Correct. From a plan enabled capacity perspective, you could do that. However, there would be a difference in terms of the feasible capacity. So within my further assessment, I have considered what the impact of that may be on feasibility.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I have not modelled their effect on capacity, I generally support the increased building heights proposed under Plan Change 9 within commercial centres and commercial areas. So as I said, the increased height generally increases the commercial feasibility of higher density residential development in line with the level of market demand. So I've taken into account the proposed increases in height together with the level of and timing of market demand within the local economy. And I consider that it is important that the height provisions within areas where residential development is appropriate are sufficient to enable the feasibility of development, noting that feasibility depends on a number of factors. I consider that the provisions for the location of higher density residential development proposed by Plan Change 9 within commercial centres and areas are generally appropriate. However, I agree with Sigma Consultants in that it may be more appropriate to instead stage the provision for higher density residential development in the commercial 6 zone west of the city centre to within the long term. So in my view, while it is unlikely to be taken up, above ground residential development in this location may undermine the commercial viability of some trade retail in this location. So while I do recognise that the FDS longer term objectives to relocate this retail into other parts of Rotorua, I note that these areas are not yet available. So the enabled capacity within the existing urban area is in comparison to an estimated total existing urban and greenfield long-term demand for an additional 9,700 urban dwellings. And I note that that includes latent demand. That was about 1,500 dwellings within the assessment, as well as the NPS UD competitiveness margin. So the actual level of growth is below that, but that is the level of demand that we have modelled. So I estimate that between 3,500 to 5,500 of the additional dwelling demand is likely to arise within the existing urban area. And so that's modelled based on a range of different scenarios, depending on whether there's an urban expansion growth pattern or an urban intensification growth pattern, with the balance occurring in the greenfield areas.
Slow you down on that one. The difference between those two figures results from?
So I modelled a range of different scenarios in terms of, so I went through a process to see how that demand could be taken up and whether there was sufficient capacity to be able to take it up. And I ran one scenario where if there was an urban expansion growth pattern, where I allocated a greater share of growth into the greenfield areas.
And sorry, just explain what you mean when you say an urban expansion growth.
A higher share of the future growth occurring in greenfield areas,
Right.
and a lower share within existing urban areas.
Right.
And then the
reverse.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. So it's the proportion spread between greenfields and brownfields, basically.
Correct.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
in that, so the total amount stays the same. It's just a redistribution of the proportions. Yeah. So my assessment has found that there is likely to be only a limited demand for higher density development. And so what I'm referring to with higher density development is the vertically stacked apartments, essentially, as well as some of the more intensive horizontally attached apartments. So I estimate that there is a projected long-term demand over 30 years for up to an additional 1,000 higher density dwellings. These are likely to be met through a combination of higher density vertically attached apartments, as well as more intensive terraced housing or horizontally attached 3-level walk-up apartments. So the comparison of capacity and projected demand suggests that only a small share, so up to 8% overall, of the modelled capacity would be required to meet long-term demand within Rotorua's urban area. I estimate that the projected demand for higher density dwellings amounts to only 3 to 4% of the enabled capacity for these dwellings. I have also modelled the effect of the application of the residential 3-zone qualifying matter, and I consider that it has only a minor effect on capacity and is unlikely to constrain the ability for Rotorua's urban area to accommodate long-term growth. It would reduce the plan-enabled capacity within the existing urban area by 0.8%, which amounts to approximately 1,000 fewer additional dwellings.
Can I just check with you if in actual fact the allocation share goes more towards greenfields than the existing urban area, does that affect the apartment estimates that you've made?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, if it did, it would only have a minor effect. It's one of the, that is one of the, I guess, one of the aspects that I did consider in that reallocation. In my view, I think that that reallocation would predominantly occur as detached dwellings. There would be some reduction, maybe a small reduction in the demand for higher intensive, I guess, more intensive vertically attached dwellings. But I generally consider that the demand for those dwellings is unlikely to reduce much because those areas are not substitutable. So I consider that there's a large amount of capacity for them.
They're not substitutable on your assumptions.
Correct. So I consider that probably the larger effect that, in addition, for example, if there were a greater share of growth occurring in the greenfield areas, I consider that would be more likely to affect the lower to medium density parts of the market.
So you don't see townhouses developing in the green areas, the greenfield areas?
Yeah, possibly I would see some townhouses developing within higher nodes of accessibility within those locations, but I think that it would have a lower effect on the more intensive townhouses and the more intensive vertically stacked apartments. So in my mind, when I'm thinking of those 1,000 additional dwellings, what I'm primarily considering are the vertically stacked apartment dwellings, possibly with some of that going to townhouses, but I generally consider that most of that demand would continue to occur within the existing urban area. Because a lot of those, in my view, a lot of the demand for that is driven by location within a central area, as opposed to the trade-off with a particular dwelling type within this context.
I guess, in terms of where my questions are coming from, if we're looking for space for 1,000 apartment buildings, I mean, that's a target which obviously has definite spatial requirement. So when we're teasing the edges as to what the extent of the high density area should be, that's a cardinal consideration.
Yes, what I have generally found is that there's a very large amount of capacity for that higher density development relative to the level of demand. For example, within the high density zone, I think option 2 had a modelled plan enabled capacity for 14,700 higher density apartments. So out of those 1,000 high density apartments, if, for example, 500 of those were met within the high density residential zone, it would result in only a very minor portion of that being taken up over 30 years. Yeah, so I don't see any constraint in terms of a sufficiency assessment within that zone. I've prepared a section. Okay. So I consider that the notified Plan Change 9 is likely to be beneficial for Rotorua's urban residential growth and development. It responds to the market constraints identified within the 2021 HBA by expanding the range of development opportunities for intensification within the urban area. In particular, Plan Change 9 would enable the delivery of smaller and lower cost dwellings that would better cater for the full range of market demand. The provisions would provide for dwellings to be constructed on smaller sites and include a greater range of medium and higher density attached housing options. So my further assessment to inform the FDS has shown that Plan Change 9 is also likely to increase the feasibility of dwelling development across Rotorua's urban area, particularly as medium density development is likely to become more established during the medium term. Importantly, it would increase the feasibility of intensification through infill and redevelopment within central residential areas. So the intensification of these areas is currently limited by the larger site size requirements and the lower potential yields under the operative district plan provisions. The application of medium density intensification provisions across the full extent of Rotorua's urban residential area would enable an intensive level of development to occur, such as terraced housing, relative to existing patterns of development. I note that the MDRS's undifferentiated provision of this intensification potential is likely to reduce the extent to which intensification is concentrated around the centres. And I consider that the provision for higher density residential development through the proposed higher density residential 2 zone is an important component of Rotorua's options for intensification. So in my view, it is very important for a well-functioning urban environment that provision for higher density development is appropriately applied. So this relates to the appropriateness of location, the scale and spatial extent of any provision relative to the local economic context and level of market demand. I support the provision for higher density residential development within commercial centres within Rotorua and within the urban residential areas surrounding the city centre. Higher density residential development in this area encourages intensification in this location, which will increase the viability and vitality of the city centre. So the provision for this development in residential zoned areas outside of commercial zones provides flexibility and choice to the market and may have different levels of commercial feasibility. I consider that the notified Plan Change 9 location and extent of the high density residential zone is appropriate within the local economic context. So taking into account the scale and timing of market demand, higher density development in this location is likely to result in patterns of intensification within inner urban residential areas that support the viability and vitality of the city centre.
Just before you go on just to close off my queries there, I think somewhere in your papers, I can't remember where it was, I think you gave an estimate that this would require something like 18 apartment buildings or something in that sort of order for the 1,000 units. Do I recall that correctly or not?
The estimate for the number of apartment buildings wasn't included in my evidence. I think it was in Ms. Dam's evidence.
Right.
And I remember reviewing that and considering that it seemed to appear reasonable in terms of the number of apartments.
Right. Okay.
What I can say is when I've looked at it more closely on a parcel by parcel basis, generally what I found is in the parcels that are developed at a general suburban scale within that residential 2 zone area, so I'm talking sites of around about 800 squares, they were generally accommodating sort of between say 15 to 35 apartments if they were developed individually.
Yeah.
The capacity is likely to be higher if they were developed more efficiently if the sites were first amalgamated.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So,
So I have now some further responses that I've prepared largely as part of my rebuttal evidence, but it's the responses to some of the issues that have come up in the submitter evidence. So firstly, the spatial extent of the residential 2 zone. I consider that the residential 2 zone, as notified under Plan Change 9, is likely to form a more appropriate spatial extent than the further expansion to this area proposed by Kāinga Ora. In my view, higher density residential development in this area would function together with the city centre to a greater extent than development located further away. Development further away from the city centre may dilute the intensification and its associated economic benefits that may otherwise occur closer to the city centre, particularly given the timing of market demand that we're talking about, market demand that occurs over a period of 30 years. So expanding the spatial extent of the residential 2 zone is unlikely to restrict future higher density development. So that's where you've got parcels instead developing at the medium density scale. In my view, if you allowed for higher density development in that location, then it would be unlikely for that to occur. So in my view, it is unlikely that landowners or developers would delay the potential returns from viable medium density development in the short to medium term for less certain returns from higher density development that is only likely to become viable at a significantly later time period. And now on the concept of relative demand.
just before you go there, just on that extent, have you considered a lesser extent of residential 2?
In terms of?
In terms of what the
less than-
effect would be if, for example, if only half of that area was actually provided for higher density?
Sorry, half of the notified area or half of the additional area?
Half the notified area.
Yes, I've considered that. And in my view, because there's a number of factors which I've taken into account. I've taken into account the spatial extent within the notified version and how that is likely, whether or not that's likely to function together with the city centre. I have also, in doing that, I have also looked at the role of the city centre within the local economic context and within the, I guess, within the local urban centres hierarchy. And if there were another urban economy where you had a similar sized centre, such as Rotorua's city centre, in terms of level of activity and range of activity, then I could consider that perhaps a reduced area may be more appropriate. However, given that the city centre is at the top of the urban centres hierarchy, the area which it would generally serve a larger relative role within that surrounding urban residential area than if that centre were located within a different level of the centre's hierarchy in another urban economy. And so therefore I consider taking that into account, together with the scale and timing of market demand, I consider that the notified area is appropriate. And I consider that it provides, across that distance, it provides a sufficient differentiation in terms of that zone from other residential areas that are further away from the city centre. And I've covered, further in my response, I've covered some of the costs in terms of what would occur if that were further expanded.
Could I just double check there? So if there were other viable or vibrant nodes, if you like, and I mean, I can only think about, Hamilton as an example, where they've got Chartwell, Rotorua and the city. Is that what you mean, where the catchments are,
Correct.
in terms of your city centre being so vital?
Correct, yes. If generally within an urban centre's hierarchy, the city centre has a wider catchment and serves much of the existing urban area than it would if the same size centre were located at a different level within the urban centre's hierarchy in another location. So as you say, for example, like Chartwell, if Chartwell were the same size as Rotorua city centre, then I'd imagine that the area would be a less extensive geographic area would be appropriate.
Right. So the size of that particular centre, because that's a mall, that's pretty much it. Then that would then for reduce the catchment, intensification catchment.
Yes. So one of the examples that I looked at, and it's in the appendix of my intensification report, the report that I did for that piece of work, was I looked at the level across which higher density development is sustained in other centres and other urban economies. And the example which comes to mind is Takapuna in Auckland's North Shore. So in that location, there's the terrace housing apartment building zone, so going quite far out from that centre. And within that centre, that's a market where higher density development is much more established, and there's a level of higher density which is sustained to a similar extent to what's notified under Plan Change 9. However, within Rotorua, I consider that even though the market is not as for high density is not as well established as it is in Auckland, the Rotorua city centre is able to sustain that type of development if it were to occur across a similar extent to that other urban area.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Concept of relative demand. So I would like to provide my view on relative demand and how I have considered this aspect within my assessment for Plan Change 9 in relation to the MPSUD Policy 5. So this is particularly important in relation to establishing appropriate provisions for higher density residential development and the intensification around centres and other key areas of accessibility. So in my view, there is an important difference between relative demand under the MPSUD Policy 5 and demand under Policy 2. So Policy 2 considers the sufficiency of capacity to meet the total projected demand in terms of the scale of realisable capacity compared to total projected demand. So relative demand instead relates to the demand for the nature of the location, the scale, for example, the height and intensity, and the spatial extent of the development. So in assessing the adequacy of provision for higher density development, it is more appropriate to conceptualise the relationship between demand and spatial extent or scale of development than to simply identify whether an area contains sufficient capacity. If only a Policy 2 approach, so in relation to the sufficiency of capacity, is taken, then I consider that it is unlikely to identify either appropriate locations or spatial extents of provision. So mathematically, the level of higher density capacity increases much more rapidly with spatial extent than either medium or lower density capacity. So when applied concentrically around centres or nodes, an ostensibly sufficient level of capacity is often rapidly reached within much shorter distances than the actual current or projected future level of relative demand. So for example, given the scale of the density of that capacity, as soon as you start moving out quite short distances, you're already in a situation where you apparently have sufficient capacity to reach that level of demand if that approach were taken. However, that may, in my view, that you often end up in situations where you've got an insufficiently small spatial extent, because the level at which the spatial extent across which a centre could instead sustain that type of development is actually much larger. So it's more appropriate to relate demand with spatial extent rather than demand with capacity, given that mathematical relationship.
But we don't have any relative demand at the moment, or we have very little relative demand.
Yes, that's correct. What I have done in recognising that, because that's an important point, is to look at the rate at which that type of development has occurred in other urban economies, which we could expect Rotorua to tend toward in the future. So one example, well, I actually took, as part of my assessment, I actually took the data on new dwelling consents by type of dwelling and plotted it for all urban economies and looked at the current relative position of Rotorua, and then looked at other urban economies such as Hamilton to see what share of their development has occurred and has occurred through time and into that higher density category. And in my view, that together with also looking at the underlying patterns of household formation and demand, that provided a reasonably good indication of what the potential future demand might be. I think that it's not something that would occur immediately. It would occur slowly, and it's more likely to become more established in the medium to longer term.
And we'll ask for your advice on how you would stage that, as you imply earlier in your brief here. So we'll deal with that later on.
Okay. So a key aspect is instead the spatial extent over which higher density development can be sustained by a centre or other node of accessibility. So this is the spatial extent across which it is likely to function together with and be supported by the centre. I have considered the concept of relative demand in my assessment for Plan Change 9 in determining the appropriateness of different levels of provision for higher density residential development in Rotorua. My assessment has considered the aspects of location, so that is where it is applied, within which centre areas and which nodes, and within these areas where I consider it is appropriate, the spatial extent across which it is applied, and also the scale, and that's in relation to height, that's the number of stories generally. So an important aspect of height is the level of feasibility together with the scale and timing of market demand. So in my view, spatial extent is a critical factor. The key factors I took into account in determining the spatial extent were firstly, the level of projected demand. So this includes the share of this type of activity within the context of total demand, rather than only a focus on the projected net increase in higher density dwellings. So I didn't just look at the projected demand and consider that there's a net increase of 1,000 dwellings across 30 years. I also looked at what share of the market that comprised. Secondly, the current and future level of market establishment for this type of demand. So that's both in terms of the demand side as well as supply side factors. And then thirdly, the role of the city centre in terms of its size and scale, but also importantly, its role within the local urban centres hierarchy. So both of these factors affect the spatial extent of the catchment area, but more critically, the relative role of the city centre within its surrounding catchment. And lastly, the total scale and geographic size of the Rotorua economy, as this affects the levels of trade-offs that households make in relation to their spatial interactions within a city, which affects the ability of a centre to support higher density development. So, for example, in the smaller urban economy, which is generally where larger areas of the urban extent are generally accessible within shorter time periods, there's less incentive to make a trade-off in terms of dwelling typology and location for accessibility than if there were greater barriers to accessing those central areas. So that's also a factor which comes into play. So as part of my assessment, I considered the spatial extent across which higher density residential development is sustained in relation to different size centres in other urban economies where the market for higher density development is more established. So in my view, this provides useful guidance for understanding the likely limits across which may be sustained in Rotorua when the market becomes more established. In most cases, higher density residential development is generally only sustained within centres or in areas that are closest to the centre's edge. So it's generally only sustained across greater distances in markets where there is a much greater demand or within which the market for higher density development is much more established. I also considered the costs of provision for this development. So in my view, provision that is too expensive may risk isolated developments occurring opportunistically that do not function together with the node of accessibility. These may dilute the intensification from occurring in other areas that are more efficient, such as those closer to the city centre. And within this, timing is also critical, as these may occur opportunistically in locations that are several decades away from the point at which these locations may function together with the city centre. And in my view, this is significant, and it represents a large proportion of the economic life of a building. So lastly, in relation to relative demand, I clarify that I have considered ranges of demand as part of my assessment. I have considered, for example, in my report, I've provided two scenarios which range between, I think, 700 to 1,000 additional dwellings. And in my view, the projected demand for apartments is already high. As set out in my primary evidence, it includes latent demand and a margin, and the actual level of take-up is likely to be lower, with the share instead met through other forms of more intensive residential development. It was appropriate to look at higher sides of demand within the assessment to determine whether the capacity is likely to provide adequate opportunity to be able to meet that demand, to make the assessment conservative. I also note that my projections include a market shift. The higher substitution scenario, which generated the 1,000 additional dwellings, already assumes that apartments will account for 17% of the net increase in dwellings within the long term. So to put this in context, this is high relative to not only the existing Rotorua development patterns, but also the patterns of dwelling growth observed in other urban economies. So for example, apartments account for 22% of new dwelling consents in Wellington from 2019 to 2022 and 18% in Auckland. I therefore consider that it is unlikely that demand for apartments will be much higher, as it would mean that Rotorua would have patterns of dwelling delivery that are more intensive than these larger urban economies, where the market for higher density dwellings is more established. Despite this, I have considered the effect of higher projections within my assessment, so as well as lower projections. For example, if demand were 50 to 100% higher, then in my view, a similar spatial extent to that notified under Plan Change 9 is still likely to be appropriate. So this is because the net demand is only one factor of relative demand, which is the key consideration in assessment for higher density development. I have considered the other factors, such as the level of market establishment above, and I note that this would result in 500 to 1,000 further dwellings if demand were higher, which still represents only a very small share of the development opportunities within the area. And I'd just like to, jump to, there's a section on the second to last page within my summary, where I have undertaken some additional modelling of the higher density residential areas in response to questions from the panel. So I have undertaken some additional capacity modelling of different parts of the residential 2 zone. I have modelled the capacity within the Whakatau block and also the proposed area of the zone on the western side of Old Taupo Road. So the Whakatau block contains a plan-enabled capacity for a net additional 2,400 dwellings, and most of this capacity occurs in areas affected by a flooding hazard. So with a capacity of only 450 additional dwellings on a few parcels at the eastern end of the block that are unaffected by flooding. So in my view, if the residential 2 zone was scaled back to only this extent, then it would be insufficient to meet long-term higher density residential demand, both in terms of capacity and appropriate scaling in relation to relative demand. And I'd just like to add to that, that it is, in my view, very important that an approach such as a policy 2 approach, where you're considering only the sufficiency, is not taken, because it would result in costs of lost opportunity to the market to be able to locate in those areas that do interact with the city centre. So it is important to move beyond just a level of provision that would meet that demand. It's also, in my view, very important to have sufficient differentiation between zones that are surrounding a city centre versus zones that are further out, which forms a key part of my assessment in supporting the appropriateness of the notified residential 2 zone. And also the second part of the modelling I undertook was the residential 2 zone located on the western side of Old Taupo Road. That contains a plan-enabled capacity for an additional 1,500 dwellings. So apologies, the table below that is printed, the headings are not very clear. But the 4th line up from the bottom of that table shows that if that area of the zone were removed, then the plan-enabled capacity would become 13,200 in the higher density zone. The rest of my summary relates to the vacant subdivision minimum lot size versus the shape factor only approach. Are there any questions on the spatial extent of the residential 2 zone before I moved on to that different topic? Okay, sure. Okay, so Vacant subdivision minimum lot size versus a shape factor only approach. Kāinga Ora have proposed the removal of a subdivision vacant minimum lot size to instead apply a shape factor only approach to forming vacant lots. I support the use of a shape factor only approach in relation to vacant lot formation on smaller parcels, so up to 1,400 square metres within the existing urban extent. I consider that this would enable greater flexibility in forming a limited number of lots around existing dwellings. I also consider it would increase the flexibility for intensification within existing urban areas and encourage a greater dwelling mix, as developers at this scale are more likely to be focused on delivering dwellings rather than lot formation. And that is a key reason. So therefore, I consider that the lot size formation using the shape factor approach within these parcels is unlikely to undermine the commercial feasibility of producing attached dwellings. I consider that it is important to have a minimum subdivision vacant lot size within greenfield areas and within larger existing urban parcels greater than 1,400 square metres. A vacant minimum lot size is likely to have an important influence on the dwelling development patterns within these areas through its effect on the commercial feasibility of different dwelling types. I support a minimum subdivision vacant lot size of 300 square metres within these areas, together with an appropriate mechanism to ensure a range of initial vacant lot sizes are formed. A range of vacant lot sizes will encourage feasibility of a range of dwelling sizes and types. In my view, these provisions will encourage a greater dwelling mix that better aligns with patterns of long-term community needs and increases level of housing affordability. This is important for a well-functioning urban environment. And I consider that there's an important difference between a vacant minimum lot size of 250 square metres and one of 300 square metres. And I have covered this in paragraph 3.52 of my rebuttal evidence, which I have here. So in my view, a minimum lot size of 300 square metres is likely to improve housing affordability at the lower end of the market. I consider that a 300 square metre vacant minimum lot size is likely to produce patterns of dwelling development that are more closely aligned with demand over the medium to longer term than a smaller vacant lot size of 250 square metres. There is likely to be a greater propensity for the substitution of detached dwelling demand into attached dwellings that are less intensive than those formed on smaller initial vacant lot sizes. So in my view, as the lot size becomes smaller towards 250 square metres, if a pair of attached dwellings were formed on those lots, then they would be more intensive than if they were formed on a larger lot size of 300 square metres. So for instance, households with an underlying preference for detached dwellings are more likely able to make the trade-offs between dwelling price, size, typology and location if the alternative dwelling, so if the attached alternative dwelling is less intensive, such as a larger duplex pair with some outdoor living area, than in comparison to a more intensive attached dwelling, such as a terraced house with a smaller yard area. And the ability to make trade-offs on these factors to accept an attached dwelling typology decreases as the topology becomes more intensive. So put simply, as lot sizes become smaller, the intensity of the dwellings tends to increase, therefore reducing the extent to which these trade-offs are likely and able to occur. This is important within the Rotorua market, as household acceptance of attached dwellings at the lower end of the market is likely to increase housing affordability. It is important to understand that these provisions apply to the vacant subdivision lot sizes. The final distribution of lots is likely to differ to this initial structure to contain a greater share of smaller lot sizes once attached dwellings are constructed and sold on separate titles. So my assessment has assumed that multiple dwellings only occur on a minor portion of lots and has not supported this approach based on any potential future infill or redevelopment of these sites, which is assumed unlikely to occur given the economic life of buildings. I consider that this approach is likely to provide flexibility to the land and property development parts of the market, where there is a large potential range of lot sizes and dwelling development patterns able to be achieved. So within this, a mechanism would still allow for a large proportion of vacant lots to form closer to minimum lot sizes, such as the 300 square metres, aligning with this part of the market demand. So there would be able to be a short-term shift towards less or smaller detached dwellings on that smaller lot size, which would increase housing affordability for that part of the market. And I consider that it appropriately balances the different parts of the market to encourage a greater range of dwelling sizes and typologies that has increased benefit to the community and housing affordability objectives. So in my view, a mechanism to assure a range of vacant lot sizes is important to discourage the development of subdivisions consisting almost entirely of smaller vacant lots, where land developers seek to maximise their returns through producing the largest number of lots rather than a focus on producing dwellings. So this, in my view, could potentially occur if a lot size were closer to 250 square metres. It would probably result, in my view, it would be more likely to result in a subdivision pattern with large amounts of smaller detached dwellings on those smaller lots, with a smaller share of those lots developed as duplex pairs, which would be likely to form a viable alternative at the lower end of the market. So this is important within small to medium urban economies where there is often less integration between the land development and property development parts of the market, or where the property development sector is not yet well established for attached dwellings. And I'd just like to also note a correction here. Earlier in the hearing, it was noted that I supported a mechanism for an average lot size of 425 square metres. That's not correct. I haven't actually stated an average lot size that I would support, but in my view, it would be smaller than that within the context of Rotorua. So that's the.
I was going to ask you, obviously, what that mechanism was that you referred to 3 times now in your statement here, and I'm assuming it is an average lot size of some sort.
Yes, I have considered an average lot size, and in my view, I think that would be an effective mechanism that would be likely to produce a range of lot sizes that would allow a level of market flexibility and would encourage a potential future dwelling mix that would better align to patterns of long-term community demand. I deliberately haven't been specific to say that it should be an average mechanism, because I am open to other potential ways in which a similar outcome could be achieved.
Well, you might be open to that, but we need to know what you're open to.
Yeah. So, for example, I consider that an average mechanism is likely to be effective and appropriate. An alternative mechanism that may also achieve a similar result could be, for example, a certain percentage of lots above a certain size. I have looked at that approach in other settings, and I consider that you could potentially have a similar mathematical outcome as an average mechanism, but I consider that provides less flexibility for the market, and an average lot size mechanism, having worked through the mechanics of that, would provide greater flexibility and would have, I guess it would provide more incentive to produce a range of different sizes than a proportion of lots above a certain size.
But your second alternative requires 2 numbers. So I'm going to press you for 2 numbers. One is, what percentage are you talking about? And secondly, what size?
In terms of the alternative, for example,
well, I mean, you've given us 2 broadcast mechanisms, but not the specifics that we would need if we were going to impose one. Yeah, how are we going to get to the numbers?
Fair enough. So in terms of the average mechanism, what I would support within the context of the Rotorua market would be a minimum site size of 300 square metres. I've put a lot of thought and analysis into that, and I think there are important differences between 250 and 300. I'm comfortable and confident with a 300 minimum site size. I think an appropriate average that would go together with that would be around 375 square metres. That would be an average in my view. I I'm sorry, but I would need further time to consider exactly what an appropriate number would be in terms of a share of lots for the alternative mechanism.
Well, I think you've got till tomorrow lunchtime. Because there are other parties who are listening who may well want to comment on that. That's the reason I suggest that.
Understand that. Yes.
So if that is a proposition that you're wanting to put on our table, I think we need to know what that is.
Yeah, it's not something that I've discussed with the planning team. The other, sorry,
That doesn't matter. It's your
Yeah.
economic assessment as to what mechanism and what the numbers would work,
yes,
rather than what the planners might think, which
Yes.
is another question.
yes, agreed. Also, the other alternative mechanism could be provisions within another chapter which encourage a range of lot sizes. I'm less familiar with what those provisions could be, so I can't provide a comment on those.
The hole is getting deeper, so don't dig anymore. Yes, right.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Rob.
Yeah, thank you. I've got just a few questions for you, and I'm going to jump between your pre-circulated primary evidence and your statement that you've read through today. So you need to have both of those documents available to you. So firstly, I'll take you to 1.9 of today's summary statement. I'm just interested when you use the phrase commercial centres, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean the city's centre zone 1, or do you mean various com zoned areas? What did you have in mind when you wrote those words?
I didn't just mean the city centre. I meant the other commercial centres where residential dwellings have been enabled. So where they've been enabled generally above ground, but also the areas, for example, I think I've said commercial. Sorry, perhaps not in this paragraph, but in other paragraphs I've referred to commercial centres and areas.
Yeah, that's in 110, the next one down. So.
Yeah, to be clear, what I mean by that is the commercial zoned areas along Fenton Street, for example, where residential dwellings are enabled.
Yeah. But it did include the CCZ1 zone. Is that what you include in your?
So I've included within my assessment, I've included, for example, the city centre zones. I think it was the city centre 1 and 3, and is it 2 on the southern?
Yep, CCZ1 is the CBD and CCZ2 is where I think Pack and Save and that kind of stuff is.
Yeah, so the areas where I have modelled include, so my model have labelled it as the southern edge, but it's where basically Countdown, the warehouse and that large format retailers. I have also looked at the area of commercial zone 6 to the west of the city centre. And also other commercial centres where residential capacity has been, there's a whole range of them within the model. Other areas, for example, include Monataha and Orwhata.
Okay. Right, so when you say commercial centre, you mean CCZ1, CCZ2, COM4, COM6, and Nongataha and Owhata.
Correct. There may also be some other centres. I would have to check the list of zones which I have in the model. There are quite a large list of centres where residential activity has been enabled.
Yeah, can you maybe dig that list out for us and provide it to us?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you, sorry.
Can you dig out that list
Yes.
and provide it to us?
Sure.
Now, I just want to take you to table 2 on page 11 of your primary evidence.
Sorry, which paragraph was it, sorry?
Table 2 on page 11 of your pre-circulated evidence in chief.
Yeah. Projected urban dwelling demand?
Yeah, in the bottom right-hand quadrant, the numbers don't add up. So the total numbers in the very bottom right-hand column should be 3, 5, 6, 3, and 9, 8, not the numbers that you've got. So I'm just wondering.
So the way I produced that table was it was produced without rounding in it, and then numbers once they're added together, once the raw numbers were produced in the table, then they were rounded. So for example, you could have a situation where you add numbers together, so essentially the numbers could appear to be 100 out within this table, but when you add the raw numbers together, then you would see that they're not.
Well, the numbers are 100 out. So what are the correct numbers? Are the numbers?
Those are the correct numbers. So for example, the number might be, it would be somewhere between 9,651 versus 9,749. It would fall within that range somewhere. But so the point was that the rounding only occurs after the number has been calculated from the raw numbers. So there's not an error there where I've first of all rounded two numbers and added two rounded numbers together.
Right. So the key thing you're telling me is that the numbers in the total column are correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So for example, you could have two 51s. You add two 51s together, and you get 102. And so your rounded number will be 100. Whereas if those two 51s were previously rounded in the table, that each round to 100, so it would appear to be 100 plus 100, and then you would expect to get 200 from that if you added a rounded number plus a rounded number. And so that's why they appear to be 100 out.
Okay. Now, I just want to take you to paragraph 11.26 of that same brief of evidence.
Thank you.
I just wonder if you could further explain what you meant there. I was particularly interested in your words. It may be appropriate to allow for a lower scale of intensification, such as that with the application of MDRs to the Res 1 zone.
Yeah. So what I meant by that, I was responding to one of the submissions which had talked about MDRS being applied across the extent of the residential 1 zone. In my view, I had thought that it may also be appropriate, well, it could be appropriate to, instead of shifting from, let's take a step back. When I modelled that, the site size was 450 within the residential 1 zone. If MDRs were applied to that, that would be up to 3 dwellings per 450 square metres. With plan change 9, there was a further increase in density beyond just applying MDRS to 450 square metres. There was a shift. What I modelled was a shift to a 300 site size. That was the site size I was given at the time of modelling, and so that would be 3 per 350. In my view, it could be appropriate to have further spatial differentiation. So, for example, to apply that 300 initial site formation around central areas on a much broader basis than the residential 2 zone, but generally the central parts of Rotorua, perhaps high levels of accessibility around outer centres, and then beyond that have the 450 site size as the starting point to achieve that greater level of differentiation.
So what would that look like on a map?
I think, in my view, probably most of the central parts. So I would say the area between Fenton Street and Old Topol Road, but then extending a bit further than that, so a bit further west than that. And then possibly some of the areas around, for example, Monataha, out around Orfata, possibly somewhere between 500 to 1,000 metres out within those outer suburban areas. And then with at a density of 3 per 300.
And in terms of between Fenton Street and Old Taupo, that defines that. How far south would it go, that option?
In my view, possibly to the apologies, I cannot remember the name of the park, but basically the southern extent of the urban area down there. So I think it's Springfield, around Springfield area. One of the reasons for that is when I was undertaking the HBA assessment, I generally found that feasibility in that area was quite constrained by that 450 site size.
Okay. All right, now.
And I'd just like to note, sorry, my further thinking that I have undertaken in relation to that 300 site size is within the context of outside of that choice. So that is within the context of this is the residential one zone, this is the options available.
Yeah. I'm just going to, in terms of the projected demand for apartments, which is the 1,000 over a 30-year time frame, I'm just interested to know in terms of your assessment, I guess backtrack a bit, and walking around Rotorua, I noticed there's a number of apartment buildings, 3 stories or more already within the city centre zone, particularly close towards the lakefront areas that we've been walking past every day as we go to breakfast. So how many of those 1,000 apartments do you or did you estimate would occur within the CC1Z zone?
The CC1, sorry, within the CC1 only or within the CC3 zone as well, so that lakefront area as well?
Yeah, or either.
Oh, right, okay. In my view, I would say between, say, half to 2/3.
Yeah.
But I would also say that within the high density residential zone could also be half to 2/3, noting that 2/3 plus 2/3 is greater than 1.
Okay, that's useful.
Yeah.
Just want to, I know the chairman's asked you this already, but given your answer there, that potentially demand for 1,000 apartments, a half to 2/3 might feasibly occur within the city CCZ1 and 2 zones. You did say CCZ1 and 2, didn't you?
Yes, when I'm assessing the, I guess, the ability for those apartments to occur, I consider the city centre collectively. I mean, the zone boundaries, given that there are relatively similar provisions, the zone boundaries are less important at that level.
And given that limited demand for apartments and the 1/2 to 2/3 in the CC1 and CCZ1 and CCZ2, I just can't escape the feeling that the notified high density zone is just way too big.
Is what, sorry?
Way too big. And that we heard from Mr. Osborne for Kaingoa, and his strong view was that it's highly desirable to encourage high density development as close to the city centre zone or the CBD as possible to realise all the accessibility and other benefits. And there was concern expressed by a number of submitters that if you have that, well, there's concern about the high density zone in general, but there's also concern that if it's too big, you get a pepper pot type development with high rises sort of occurring in an ugly manner haphazardly. I can't escape the feeling that it's just over catered for at the moment.
Yeah, I can understand that, and it's certainly something that I considered as part of my assessment. So when I initially, I've got a couple of points in relation to that. When I firstly assessed that zone, I looked at that and my first instinct was, yes, that is too large. However, having gone through the process and looked at the level to which that area might function together with the city centre, I consider that it is likely to represent an appropriate extent. Part of that is also looking at the role of the city centre within Rotorua's economy. Generally, if it were the same size centre within another part of the urban hierarchy, then I would agree that it would be too extensive. But given that it is a city centre and a high proportion of the activity and the daily needs are met within the city centre, within the context of Rotorua, then I think that it's appropriate to have it across a larger spatial extent than would be in another location. The second point that I would like to make is that you could potentially get some isolated developments. I'm reasonably comfortable taking into account the role and function of the city centre and the level of accessibility. Also looking at Mr. Wallace's accessibility study, that those developments, even if they are isolated in the sense of a standalone vertically attached apartment dwelling structure, that they would still be able to be supported by and function together with the city centre. But within that spatial extent, they are likely to be surrounded by further intensification, possibly at the medium density scale, rather than the area simply remaining as low density detached dwellings. I mean, this would occur through time. It wouldn't be something that would occur immediately. My concern in terms of the isolated nature of those developments occurs as you start to move further out from that. Part of that is also balanced with the costs that form part of that equation at that point, because the development would, in my view, be located sufficiently far from the city centre that it would be less likely to interact and function together with the city centre. And you would start to get drop-offs in the level of demand from those households accessing the city centre for that frequency and need than you would within that notified extent.
Just 2 or 3 more. Interested at your summary statement now, still your para 1.11. And when you say you agree with Sigma, it may be more appropriate to stage the provision for HDR within the COM6 zone. And the question I had, would the same argument also apply to the CCZ2 zone then, which has extensive development within it already? I think it's Pack and Save and other similar developments. They're unlikely to move somewhere else also, aren't they? Wouldn't the same arguments apply to that zone?
No, there's a couple of points that I took into consideration with that. The short answer is I don't think they would. And the explanation for that is that within there's quite a difference in terms of the retail within those 2 locations. So, for example, in the commercial 6 zone, where I think it would be appropriate to stage it, that retail tends to be, or at least a component of it tends to be trade retail, and the feasibility of that retail floor space is quite different to the feasibility of the floor space in that other area of the city centre 2 zone. In my experience, trade retail, the feasibility of that retail would be undermined by the consequent change in retail floor space that would need to take place to be able to accommodate residential development in above ground floors, and that the quality of that floor space would generally increase, and therefore the cost of it would increase, and the large, more space extensive needs of that type of retail would therefore undermine the feasibility of that. And together with that point too, is, in my view, that trade retail is located in an efficient location. And my concern is that if that trade retail is displaced, then it would be likely to locate in a less efficient location within the urban spatial economic structure. Particularly, it might put, my concern is that it may put pressure on, for example, light industrial zones, because that tends to form the alternative location. The retail in the other location, the city centre 2 zone, I consider that those effects would apply to a much lesser extent. What I have seen in other urban economies is that retail is much more able to locate on the ground floor, given the nature and type of and cost of floor space that it requires. And together with that retail naturally tends to have much stronger agglomerative forces with other retail offered within the city centre, and so is less likely to relocate and displace other types of activity in less efficient locations.
Okay. And just a couple more. Your paragraph 1.31, subclause A in your summary statement. So when you talk about the share of this type of activity, is that just the 1,000 apartments over the projected urban demand of 5,600, which gives me 18% or 17 point something percent? Is that what you mean by share?
Correct, but 17% comes from the denominator at 9,700.
So what's the numerator?
1,000. I think the 5,600 refers to the higher share that would occur just within the urban intensification scenario within the existing urban extent.
Yeah.
Whereas that 17% is calculated across demand, urban demand for the city as a whole.
Yeah, okay.
And what I mean by that is it's important to look at the extent to which that demand, so it's not just the scale of that demand, it's how prevalent it is within the general patterns of demand. So what share of the demand is met within that typology as opposed to just the total number.
Yeah. See, 1,000 divided by 9,700 is 10%.
Oh, sorry, I do offer a correction to that. If we go back to table, I think it's table 2 in my primary evidence. It was the share of net additional demand that occurs in the longer term. So it would be the demand which is occurring from, so it's not actually in this table, it's back in my, sorry.
All right.
That's in my intensification assessment report.
That's why I thought it was 1,000 divided by 5,600, because that is 17%.
Yes.
Was that just coincidental, is it?
Coincidental, yes.
Right.
Apologies for that. Yeah, part of the process what I did, I looked at not only the demand across that period in its entirety, but also the shifts in demands as they occurred, as they were sequenced within that time period.
Okay.
So it's essentially 17% of the net increase in demand that occurs between 2030 and 2050. And you are right that it would make up a smaller share across that total period, because in the short to medium term, the share of demand, that net increase in demand as apartments, would be lower than it is within the longer term.
Yeah.
But basically my point was that by the time we get to the longer term, it's sitting at 17%, and that's really high in comparison to what's happening now in other urban economies where that market is much more established.
Yeah, I don't follow all of that. So can you just write down for us later?
Okay.
Like what you mean by share and where the various numbers come from. So having a narrative what you meant by share, and then say it's these numbers and where they came from.
Yes.
Just set that out, because I didn't quite follow what you're saying then, but rather than get you repeat it, it'd be easier if you just wrote it down.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just make a note of that.
Yeah, and so it's that para 1.31 subclause A, just what share means and how you calculated it.
Yeah.
And by the sounds of it, you should spread that across time as well, shouldn't you? I mean, just what you're saying is that by the time we get to 30 years out, it might be representing 17%, but 15 years out from now, it probably represents less than 1%.
Exactly. Yes. I think it was about 4% in the short term. And then by the time you get sort of that, 20 to 30 years.
Maybe even show the share across time.
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay, sure.
And now just taking you to the very end of your supplementary statement, para 147. And thanks for producing that table in response to some of our questions. It's helpful.
You're welcome.
I just want to ask you about the to what extent the flooding is actually a real as opposed to an imagined constraint. I imagine the flooding here must, and probably you can answer this, but someone in reply will answer the question, I'm sure, is that the flooding must be related to an inadequate stormwater system, because there's no kind of major rivers in the area that I'm aware of that would cause that flooding, and that of course can be engineered away. So I don't see that as a necessary capacity constraint. And also, if there's no, would it be a constraint at all if there was no residential development on the ground floor? Because it's the flooding, if it does occur and it's stormwater related, is unlikely to go above the first floor level, isn't it?
So what would the anticipated development on the ground floor be?
Or anything that's not residential, pretty much what's occurring in the city centre zone at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, my concern with that is that the city centre zone is already quite large in terms of the spatial extent of commercial activity.
Mhm.
It may be more difficult to expand that out further.
Yeah, well, might be a car park.
Oh, right. Yep. Fair enough.
So it's not really a question for you, but I'm just, it was interesting that you said there's an additional 2,400 dwelling capacity in that block that Ms. Dahn identified. And I guess what I'm saying, and I'd like the officer to address and reply, I don't see the existing flooding problem as a development capacity constraint on that area, given it's likely an engineering solution as possible, or if not, we could just have car parks or something else on the ground floor. So just using your evidence as an opportunity to put some questions to the rest of the team.
Yeah.
All right, that was all I had for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've only got a couple, as in three. So going back to, you talked about Kāinga Water's presentation. This may not be a question for you, but we've received submissions. I think it was one from Sigma, or at least one from Sigma, saying that the maximum permitted height should be halved. And then in the central city zone, and then another submitter, Rotorua Lakes, saying that should be unlimited. What comment do you have there in terms of where the limit should be, or even to Rotorua Lakes' point, if there should be a height limit?
I've got a few comments in relation to that. I would not favour a decrease in heights. Firstly, I consider that a decrease in heights may limit the feasibility of that development. So if there's a situation where buildings are, particularly within a commercial zone, where buildings are less than 5 or 6 stories, then the feasibility starts to become quite challenging, particularly within the context of a market where there is lower demand for that type of typology, and where prices are correspondingly lower. You need to have an increased number of stories to be able to increase the feasibility of that development. Also,
That's if it's lower.
That's if it's lower. I think that reducing the number of stories would start to impact upon the feasibility, and you'd be less likely to get that form of development. In my view, there possibly wouldn't be much effect through increasing or having an unlimited level of height within the city centre area, because you simply wouldn't have the market demand, particularly taking into account the timing of the market demand, to be able to construct a building that was quite substantially taller than the height limits.
Okay, so yeah, not saying that obviously we haven't landed, but if we had no height limit in the city, that would be unlikely to result in a negative consequence.
Yeah, I think that if there were no height limit, then you would be unlikely to get development that would go above what the proposed limits are, because you wouldn't have sufficient demand, taking into account also the timing of demand. It's a medium-sized urban economy where the annual increases of demand are not sufficient to be able to sustain a much taller building. You'd have to be in a much larger urban economy when there's larger annual increases in demand for it to be feasibly taken up at a rate that would offset the costs of constructing a building at that height.
Okay, then why put a limit on it? It sounds like I'm challenging you. I'm not. I'm just playing with the idea.
Yeah, fair enough. From
an economic point of view, what's the magic of 32 metres?
I think with 32 metres, it provides a level of development which is likely to enable feasibility. So in my view, feasibility is within the commercial zone. Once you get above sort of 5 or 6 stories, particularly 6 stories or more, then you start getting into a position where there's a level of feasibility where it's more likely to be feasible. If you go below that, then it starts to become challenging in terms of having an insufficient yield to offset those higher construction costs. I think within the Rotorua context, given the overall scale and the timing of demand, that you're unlikely to get development which is going to go above 32 metres. So if 32 metres is, say, up to say 10 stories, or say 8 to 10 stories, I don't anticipate that there would be development which would go above that. And so I think it provides a reasonable level of scope within for the market.
What's the tallest building in Rotorua at the moment? What's the height of the tallest building? Do we know? It's about 32. It is 32 or it's about 32? That's what I wondered. Okay. Yeah, right. There you go. There's your answer.
Thank you. And you referred to the FDS in your presentation. We've heard that throughout the hearing, including recommendations that we give little or no weight to the FDS just because of where that is. Do you have any view on what weight we should be giving the FDS in our deliberations?
I would probably say that that's a planning question in terms of the weight to give to it in relation to its stage of the process. I'd probably be less comfortable answering that. In terms
That's
of,
fine.
Oh, okay,
That's fine. I'm just checking.
thank you.
Yeah. Just because you're on section 42A team, so I thought I'd find the
Yeah.
opportunity there. Anyway, last question from me is that you've talked about back to 1.11, and apologies, you may have already answered that in the previous question. I was trying to find information, but you've referred to Sigma Consultants' view and agreeing that staging would be a good approach. My words, not Sigma's, is that PC9 is sort of a blunt tool compared to staging of bringing zones online or what have you. How did I hear that right in terms of that's what you're supporting, one, and then secondly, how would we do that through PC9 in terms of providing for staging? Because I don't recall seeing anything about staging.
Yeah. Possibly in terms of the mechanism to apply that staging, it's probably more of a planning question. From an economic perspective, what that would translate into in terms of my assessment would simply be whether or not the development was able to occur, and considering the appropriateness of the timing with which it was able to occur. I couldn't provide a clear answer in terms of what would be the appropriate planning tool or role within a plan to trigger that.
Fine. We'll sort that out during the response. Yeah. Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to finalise on that, finish on that last one. I thought your earlier evidence was that development west of the city centre in terms of that commercial 6 zone was unlikely in the short term anyway.
Yes, I consider
staging is not necessary, is it, if that's the case?
Yeah, I consider it as unlikely. I consider that it would be unlikely to occur. However, if it did occur, then this is what I consider the effect it would be. So I've sort of set my assessment up there as a conditional. So yeah, possibly if it wasn't staged, then it may not have any effect because it is unlikely to occur.
Thank you, Ms. Fairgray. It's an extended 40 minutes. Yes, right. But thank you for that. I mean, obviously your evidence is pivotal to a lot of the submitters' objections and opposition and so on. So useful to have you here to answer all of that. So thank you very much. And if you do have the ability to tell us what the mechanism numbers should be by this time tomorrow, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I'll do my best to have a look at that in more detail.
I find when it comes to numbers, a cup of coffee is really good.
Thank you.
And we are going to take a cup of coffee. Right. We've got, yes, I think they've been hovering around, haven't they? Yes. If you would just indicate to them that we're running an hour late, that would be useful. They're coming back tomorrow. Okay. All right. Okay. Yes, Mr. Milne is here. Yes, yep. Right, we'll just take a 15-minute break, Mr. Milne, and then we'll come back to you. So let's, what are we now, 25 past? Thank you.
Let's grab a bit of a drink. Oh, okay, sorry. I heard my name. That's all right. I stretch my legs. I hate sitting down. Hey? They call me, sorry. Do they call me? Oh, sorry. I'm talking about River. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
All right, let's resume. Thank you, Mr. Milne. It's, thank you for
Okay.
waiting for us. That's good of you. And Mr. Milne, we have your submission in front of us. Now sit down, please.
Yeah, okay. I was just listening. What's this? Yeah, I haven't elaborated on it. I put it in, but I really want to talk about liquefaction.
Righto.
And I did mention that, but I couldn't find my submission, and it's been a while.
Don't worry, we have it here. And yes, you talk about, well, you.
Yeah, and there's a few other issues that I'm not going to be into the social part of it.
Right.
I'll just give a brief background of myself. I grew up in New Plymouth, and my father, Major Milne, fought in Casino in Italy, and then he separated from my mother after the war. And I came up from New Plymouth to the Woodsman School in 1955. So I've been around a long time. And then he drew a ballot farm at Upardimuri, and in the district here. And I reconnected with him. And then I was working around the district there, picking up hay and all that stuff. And I sort of know the area well, and played rugby in town here, different stuff. I'm 84 now, nearly. And I've been tramping around here for the last 30 years, everywhere, and in New Zealand. Proper tramping, not just mucking around. Yeah, so and I live out in Linmore. I sold the farm and we bought a house out there because it was in the county. We didn't want to come in the city. And then it amalgamated. And there was no houses out there then, you know. So most of Linmore, we're in old Linmore, is now new houses. So there won't be much infill going in there for a while. But and there's a lot of trees out there. So I don't know how they're going to fit in with infill housing. They cut them all down, do they? And, but I want to elaborate on this liquefaction. Now we're sitting in here in a caldera. 240,000 years ago, it blew out. Most of it's up in the Mammoths. I've trampled bush there, know it all around here, everywhere. And then the lake developed in it, obviously, and for about 60,000 years ago, the lake was right up the rim, Rotorua, and because the outlet was blocked by other volcanoes which blew up about 5,000 years ago. So underneath us here, and I'm going to elaborate on a lecture that Brad Scott gave us. You know who Brad is? Yep. In 2000, but it's silted up in a lake over thousands of years. You know, I'm talking a long time back, wasn't around then. And it's 300 feet of silt under here, which is liquefaction territory. And the year 2000, I went to a lecture at the museum. Brad Scott gave it, and it opened my eyes out. He demonstrated liquefaction. And most of the people there, I'm 80, there were about 60. No council people were there. They don't want to know about it, even then. And he showed us what liquefaction was, and then I knew about it. And I've always had an interest in geology and with my tramping and out in the area. And when I came to town, I sold the farm and I started a tractor mowing business. And then the council asked me if I'd do all their sections for them. They were like fire control work. They had hundreds of them floating around then in the 80s and 90s. They weren't subdivided. You know, grown grass once a year to be cut and fire risk and all that stuff. I did that for a long time. And half the sections I went on at different times were wet, waterlogged, you know. And I took an interest in it, and I've spoken to builders over the years. They put their footings down, about a foot down, it's water. And that's going to get worse because these lakes are coming up now. And, you know, that's what's happening. And the Lake Rotorua here has got a flood zone. I don't know whether you looked that one up. I have. And it comes all round, you know. So it's going to be a problem here. Now, he gave a very good lecture. And after that, when Christchurch happened in 2010, I've got a cousin down there, same age as me, and they were farming out near the red zone, not near it, and her father, they were farmers, they were going to buy a bit of land there and graze cattle on it, you know, or milk on it or whatever. And my grandfather, our respective grandfather in Christchurch, who's a businessman, he imported bicycles, funnily enough, around it. Now he'd be a car dealer. Yeah, and he said to them, don't touch that land. You can't even put cattle on it. It's soft. It's swamp. It's no good. Now, 60s, 70s, boom going on there. And whether the councillors were, you know, getting a bit of behind the scenes or whatever, I don't know. That's her words too. And then the commissioners coming on, and the environmental commissioners, and they can override the councils if they want to. Now, the red zone was all put into housing, put roads in, all that stuff. Same thing they're trying to do around here. They're dreaming. And we know what happened in the red zone. That's all land now, trees growing on it. Every house, it cost millions because of bad decisions. The council there should never let that get built on. And Rotorua here, and I know it well because of this mowing business I had and stuff like that, especially Fenton Park, there's hundreds of bores that were closed down when the geothermal closed down. And I've got a good source on the council here, it works. I won't name them, but told me a few things over the years. If we get an earthquake here, which we won't get a massive one, but we might get a 6. And there's a fault line going through, you know about it, from Rotorua Bluffs through the back of the rim here, goes through out there, back of Linmore, but over the hill. And that doesn't go off very often, but it could go off. And it'll probably give us a 6 year. Okataina, there's problems out there. And actually, the last earthquake out there, we felt it up in Linmore, funnily enough, more than they did in town. And also when Ruapehu blew up, in the late 80s, we had about 2 inches of silt came through here, you know, the stuff. And now, this infill housing, I don't know how the heck you're going to clean the spoutings out. And another thing that's cropped up since my submission came in, I'll go back to spread in a minute, is the global warming. It's getting hotter. They're telling people to put a few trees around, you know, absorb it. My mother lived in Miro Street for years, dead now. Linmore was 10 degrees cooler than she was there because it's all exposed and tar sealed. These buildings are going to be built. And another thing that's cropped up since my submission, the fire service around New Zealand are worried about getting the fire engines in there, getting the hoses in there. And getting back to the liquefaction that's going to happen here, we'll get one, we'll get an earthquake. Now, it's not going to kill people, but it's still going to be a good one. And there's not really many fault lines under here, but every now and then it settles, you know. And the whole area has got, all the perimeter out here has got layers from the old lake back on the mountain there. And a big slide happened out the Paradise Valley Road. Friends of mine, it came off the hill there, went across the river and into their paddock. because it slipped off and the regional council said, well, it's got different layers there that causes that, you know. And this, I'm a bit worried about some of the stuff going in around here too in the hills, but okay. Liquefaction is going to stop it. Not stop it, but you're going to have to do geotechs on every blinking house you build. Not you guys personally, but it's going to cause issues. That Malfoy Road thing that they put all those houses on, I don't know whether you guys know, there's a hot water bore in the middle of that. Now, my source here said they're very worried if we get liquefaction like they did in Christchurch, and they didn't expect it there. These bores that have been capped off years ago, they're going to blow out. And they're going to be hot water, not just cold water. And you won't have girls with shovels and boys from the universities going around shoveling it out, you know. And then you're going to have these houses that people are putting in, and we could be a bit vulnerable on them more because it's older houses.
I appreciate the caution that you're putting on our table, Mr. Milne. But,
Yeah. Now, Brad Scott
Yep.
gave that lecture, as I said. Christchurch, this can relate this to the Christchurch red zone. It's going to happen here at some stage. And the geothermal issues around here, there was an issue cropped up on the cemetery reserve here just the other day. Kevin Winters luckily did a submission from the regional council. The council here is just stupid. They get times. They're going to give that land. Well, no, it's all right. It belongs to the Ngāti Whakaui as a, gift for a cemetery. It's got geothermal under it. It's in there, and there's a hot pool in the middle of it. I don't know if they know about that or not. I don't know. And it's going to be a problem. There's maps out. They've worked out around where all the geothermal is around Rotorua City. Yeah. It's everywhere. It goes out this way. It goes.
Let me take you to what's your recommendation to us?
Well, you've got to have access to what we've got now. Most of Linmore has been, I'm on my help property there is we had another property, it was half an acre, but we sold that. It was built, they were big sections, put it that way. We had half an acre up there on the other house, and they put, every section's been subdivided, but some of the houses out there might be ripped down. There's one section out there, it's been a bit debatable at the moment, and they're going to put these things up there, and I'm not talking social now either. I'm not thinking that way. And this caldera here, there's not many cities around the world built in a caldera. Very few, not of this side. Mexico City's issues there. And the Philippines have got Jakarta, is it? Sydney. And this lake here is coming up. Look, it's happening at Rotorua at the moment. Mead Street blew out the other day, that hot water. It blew out about 20 years ago. I drew it to the attention of the council about that 1 year ago, where the grass was dying, a section I made for them there, yeah. So it's everywhere. Now, you've got to leave room around houses to have access for the fire people. When there's a fire and an eruption, Tarawera blew up, the ash came over there, came from Ruapehu. And I can't see that when they do a geotech on all the land, and they have to do it around here now, they're going to find hot water, they're going to find water table a foot down. I know the area. I've tramped in it everywhere. And our group, we used to tramp around here when it was a wet day or something in the town area. It's just impossible to put infill housing in. Forget about the people looking at you in the bedroom or something like that. It's going to be an issue. And I can't see, and that's why I brought this Brad Scott thing up. It was a very good thing, and the red zone was a good example of it. They never expected an earthquake in Christchurch.
We appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
Yeah.
Certainly,
And as I said, my grandfather said to them, don't go and even buy it for cattle. It's a swamp. And that's what happened there. So this will happen here too. The end of the airport out here is on shaky ground, not geothermal, when they did the extension. I've got the information on that one, but
All right,
it's just not suitable.
let me just see if there are any questions for you. Tiffany, do you have any questions? Mr. Milne?
And I think thanks a lot. As Chair said, you've given us a lot to provide caution towards. Kia ora.
No question.
Well, thank you for your submission, Mr. Milne. Appreciate your coming today.
Yeah. I'm just giving you facts. I'm not
Yep.
asking you to sort of ask me. Yeah, I mean, I've been around, mate, and
Yep.
as a farmer, contractor, I know the area. And
Well, sorry, I'm afraid your time's up, Mr. Milne.
You're done?
I'm afraid your time is up.
well, if you don't want to listen to me, it's a bit like the council here. You've had your time, Mr. Milne. Yeah, this is information that you need to know.
We have it on your submission. We've got it on our table, and thank you for bringing it.
Well, okay. Just briefly, Brad Scott is very well qualified by you.
And I know that in terms of geothermal stuff, that IGNS, who
Yeah,
Brad works
yeah,
for,
Janice, and he's,
IGNS was involved with
Yep.
the report that was
Yeah.
done. So
yeah, but at your own peril, you allow infill housing to happen in Rotorua. It just won't happen because the ground is no good.
and the engineers can establish that. Yes.
Yeah, so, that's all I can tell you. I could take you out in a little van and show you all the area. We could walk around. I can show you there. That's a wet spot. That's not that. How the heck are you going to get rid of that water underneath? Well, I mean, I can't believe. I was a farmer and I managed a big company development project in Chapo years ago, for an Auckland businessman. Big deal. We did everything right. Yeah, and I can't believe that this is happening now. This money wasted on these meetings. Rotorua is not suitable for it.
Thank you. Thank you,
It's
Mr.
just
Milne.
not suitable.
I understand that. Yep.
Okay, but have a good chat to Brad.
Yep.
I did, and process, get touch there and see what happened there.
I know all about Christchurch. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Milne. Shirley Gifford? Thank you. And it's just, 109 further submission. Thank you, Ms. Gifford, and you made a further submission. I've just pulled that up on my screen here, supporting a number of parties and opposing some others. Yeah, so you want to just summarise your submission for us and we'll go to questions.
Sure. Firstly, I'd just like to say that I do appreciate the opportunity to actually be heard further on my submission. I'd also like to put it in context of what it's like for an ordinary Rotorua resident to be involved with the process. It's incredibly daunting and there's a huge volume of material to get up to speed with, and it's overwhelming. So I appreciate the process that you yourselves have to go through.
Tell us where because I don't think we have an address for your submission. Whereabouts do you live?
Yep. So by way of background, I live at Hamarana
Right.
on a residential sized block, and am also a property owner of a property on Ranoff Street, which is within the residential 1 zoning area,
Yep,
which
thank you.
we are looking to develop. So I come as both a resident of Rotorua with a keen interest in its urban development, as well as a developer.
Okay.
So I would have thought that I'm typical of a Rotorua resident, working to survive, raising a family, running a household, working in the community, helping family and friends. So it's impossible to give the hours, the days and the weeks that would be needed to be able to respond to this into the intricate detail, which I'd like to. So I've sort of limited myself to the general concept that I feel able to talk about. And I'd also like to think that the submissions made by residents of Rotorua are seen in the context of the significant effort that they have to go to in order to make a submission, and the guts that it takes to be part of such a big and scary process.
Well, you've gone to a length that a lot of submitters haven't. So Yeah, you've obviously put some serious effort into this.
I did, and just on the point of my further submission, there's just one rider on that I'd just like to mention. But I was getting to the end, it was close to midnight on the day that the submissions were due. It came to the residential or to the density of 250 square metres, which I thought was a great idea. Infilling is a great idea. But I also think about the importance of doing that in line with expert evidence as to the suitability of that for would have been able to escape groundwater escaping. So I'm not opposed to increasing housing density, but proceeding in a manner that is well planned. And in this day and age, with knowledge of planning implications, we should be clever enough to enable development to occur in a manner that enhances uses of resources and avoids adverse effects. So it's not in question that increased heights and minimised yardage rules in Plan Change 9 will have real potential to create significant adverse effects from shading. And that's my main issue. But the lack of weight given to such an adverse consequence is alarming. The importance of access to sunshine is well recognised. It helps to warm and power homes. Its absence can have a detrimental effect on physical and mental health. Imagine the devastating effect for occupants of existing houses who have access to this amazing resource and then to be shut out from the sun by a neighbouring high development without any regard to the loss. It just seems nuts. The issue of cold homes and effect on health in Rotorua is well recognised as an issue, and why we are about to make things worse and potentially shade out already suffering homes is a mystery. It's not a mystery. It doesn't seem appropriate for planning laws to manipulate the market. In one fell swoop, Plan Change 9 moves power away from existing owners and occupiers and places it in the pockets of developers without any redress to existing owners and occupiers who will wear the significant adverse effects of development without mitigation or compensation. Yes, we can address unreasonable sticking points in the resource consent process, but it doesn't mean the pendulum has to do a full swing into the hands of the developers. I'm a developer, as mentioned, but don't expect such a handout at the expense of the surrounding properties. Pre-existing height protections were developed for a reason, but will be abolished despite those reasons still existing. And I question how that is good urban planning. Plan Change 9 is a one-size-fits-all solution, but there are so many different sizes within the proposed higher density areas. Unfairness and inequity occurs where there is no room to account for individual circumstances. For example, I can think of existing height differences between sections. There could be several metres height difference, which would compound the effects of the increased building heights, but no room to take into account these pre-existing differences. As an example, the property I talked about that I own on Renoff Street is approximately a metre lower than the neighbouring property. I also have a friend in the area whose property is 2 metres lower than its neighbour. A development that has a buffer, such as a road on its southern side, that may be suitable for a higher development compared to something which doesn't have that buffer behind it. A tailor-made approach is required that is adaptable to the particular environment. And I note that Section 77G of the RMA enables the Territorial Authority to create new residential zones to incorporate the MDRS. New subdivisions are well suited to implementing the higher building heights as all new housing can be developed in a way that is suitable to high buildings. They could also have buffer zones to existing lie-lowing residential neighbours. Any intensification of heights in existing areas should be on a very controlled basis to protect the fundamental right to sunshine. Increased heights don't have to be on such a wide-ranging scale as proposed. In both height, so 2-storey could be adequate, and in the area that it covers, so the extensive wide-ranging area of the current zones. A drive around our central urban area shows how towering 2-storey houses are amongst single-storey dwellings. 3-storey would be just nuts. I note that Anne Nichols in her statement referred to a smaller area of change to avoid the urban sprawl of ad hoc higher properties. And this would also enable adverse effects to be identified and addressed, and also the impact of the higher density in height before expanding the area. Greater heights outside of this area should remain subject to the resource consent process so adverse effects can be addressed. Matters of national importance within Section 6 of the RMA requires protection of outstanding natural features from inappropriate subdivision and development. I would argue that existing access to the sun should be recognised as an outstanding natural feature. Objective 1 of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development requires a well-functioning urban environment that enables all people and communities to provide for their health and safety. Now and into the future, sun is important to health. Objective 8 requires New Zealand's urban environments to support reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and resilient to the current and future effects of climate change. Access to sunlight is a natural, renewable energy directly addressing that objective. So in conclusion, yes, we have a shortage of housing, but could we please increase our density using wise planning choices? I would be asking the commissioners to recommend a scaled back version of Plan Change 9 that, among other things, would reduce the impact of the shading effect. And I wish that I had the opportunity or the time to actually, provide a detailed plan change as to how I would see it going forward. But we're in your hands as the experts as to that, and with the people of the time to be able to do that. Could we take advantage of increasing density in the new subdivision areas while proceeding with increased density in existing zones on a controlled basis that places adequate weight on the significant value of access to sunshine and in a manner that is sensitive to the Rotorua environment? And I would add to that, and in a manner that also addresses the flooding issues that we've seen as of late in Rotorua. Hope you've had a lovely time staying here in Rotorua.
Thank you, Ms. Gifford.
I noticed you were, thank you for your submission. I noticed you were reading something. It'd be great if we could get a copy of that. Thank you.
Would you like me to?
That's right. If you've got an electronic file, you can send that through later. If
Okay,
that's easier.
Give you a copy
All right,
now.
hard
They're just
copy.
not stapled.
All right.
Is that all right?
Yeah. Good. Cool.
Just two questions. I know you made a large number of further submissions, but two matters I picked up I'd like to ask you about. The first one, I think, in one of your further submissions, and correct me if I read it wrong, because I was primarily going off the summary recently, is that you didn't think residential development in the city, the CCZ1 zone, was appropriate. Have I read that correctly?
Which one is it?
I don't have it in front of me now. I just noted down that one of your further submission points was summarised as.
Yeah, again, I would bow to the experts, but I would also ask that we're not just looking at it from a building and resources point of view, that we're also looking at the social impacts on people and the types of people that perhaps would be drawn to those buildings, who would be staying, who would be using those apartments.
Mhm.
I'd be looking at the existing apartments that we have in Rotorua, and do we have any issues arising out of that? I don't have answers to that, but
Yeah.
I'm hoping that as a result of this thorough process, that all of those types of questions would be asked, and that we also look at the social implications of having high density living in apartment buildings. Our minds automatically go to council estates, for example, in the UK, and the adverse effects that come out of that.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. And the second question, I think one of your further submissions referred to a concern about parking. Do you want to
Yes.
expand on that for us? What that
I'm
concern is?
greatly concerned that we have eroded the requirement to have parking on site. So In other cities where they're a lot more reliant on public transport, that could perhaps be appropriate. But here in Rotorua, we all have at least one car, if not two, and sometimes three cars because our kids have cars as well. I'd love us to be an area where we cycle everywhere, but we're not there yet. So car parking is crucial. And when that has to move onto the streets, that becomes a real hazard for all road users. It's dangerous. If you drive around Auckland amongst all the cars there, it would be, imagine the safety improvement if the cars weren't on the road. You know, they're a huge problem. And also, if I think of the example up where we are, where our property is, top of Ranulph Street, and there's shops across the road for it, those shops really rely on access to those car parks as well. And that would have a detrimental impact on their business if they were filled by residents, which is what would happen.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gifford. Just make 2 points, I guess. And one is, as you'll appreciate from the reading and the work that you've done, is there is a sense in which both council and ourselves hands are tied to some extent with respect to the issue of multi-storey buildings, because this whole exercise is designed precisely to actually ensure that. So, I mean, that's I say that just as a bit of a statement, which is not to say that sunlighting and daylighting are not relevant issues. They absolutely are relevant issues, and certainly well aware of those issues. Parking, of course, council had no option but to actually, it cannot any longer put parking controls in its district plan because of, well, the same NPSUD that we've been talking about. It does and can, of course, impose standards for those developers who in actual fact are providing parking. So that's up to the development community to actually put the parking in place. And I guess the question is whether in actual fact the market is such that that few developers would not put parking in place at the moment, because it is well, it's a car city at this stage. It may not be in 20 years' time, but it certainly is at this stage. So recognise those points. So, but thank you very much for your submission. Very thoughtful. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Is it Mr. State or is Mr. Davis here? Mr. State. Mr. State, come forward. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, he's not here apparently. Just volume 178. Hang on a second, let me get volume 1, page 78 submissions. Also, separate statement. Right, Mr. State. So, sorry, I was just pulling up your submission. Sorry for that. I've got that now in front of me. Right.
Well, thank you, Your Honours, for allowing me to speak. I'll be brief. So I'll summarise my submission by simply focusing on the rights of Aboriginal natives as defined in the Royal Charter of Queen Victoria in 1840. So I refer to myself as an Aboriginal native by descent, rather than a Maori, which is founded on legislation called the Maori Real Estates Act, Maori Real Estates Management Act 1867. It constructs the word Maori. So that's not me. I'm an Aboriginal native, as the Queen identified my ancestors. Now, upon that basis, my rights, as she covers them in her charter, are rights protected for all time. And so too the descendants of all the Aboriginal natives that she was referring to in these lands, these 3 islands. She refers to the North Island, where I live in Rotorua, as the island of New Ulster. So I learn now to identify myself as an Aboriginal native in Ngāpuna, the southeast shore of Lake Rotorua, centred approximately in the middle of New Ulster. Now, having said that, my family, I was raised in my early years in Rotorua. We had, my mother and her brothers and sisters had 30 acres of land at the corner of Homestead Road and State Highway 5. They sought to have that land available to them to build papakainga. They were refused. It split the family, and a lot of my first cousins had died homeless. Because of that inability to build papakainga on their own mana whenua land that was gifted or handed down to them, it's left a sore point for my family for years. Today, I come here a little bit charged up, but identifying that I had rights that ought to have been protected. And I would like, in summary, for this commission to please take note that Aboriginal and Native people deserve protection. It's been emphasized by the 2003-2004 Privy Council on behalf of the Royal Monarchy. They refer back to Victoria's law, and I wish that the commissioners would look to uphold what was intended, what became law by the Queen's Charter, which was not honoured, and the Privy Council go through that the judges, the judiciary of this country ought to have done a better job. And even Queen Elizabeth II in 1990 said that the Treaty of Waitangi has been imperfectly observed. I didn't want to mention the Treaty of Waitangi because it's done its dash. The Royal Charter of Victoria has a lot more weight, commands for officers and ministers, both civil and military, to be obedient when she laid down those laws. I'm hopeful that going forward, with all that we've lost over the 183 years, that this commission would see my submissions. I've sent you the charter. I emphasize and put a lot of weight on that charter as being about the only instrument that might compel a change in this country, to allow close proximity housing for generations to come to live on their rural lands without hindrance of colonial, draconian design for papakainga. And that's what I saw in the proposal. It was not good to me. I think restricted from memory, and I'm sorry, I have to go from memory because I can't find my original, but I think it was that the proposal was one house per 2,000 square meters, which that's a lot of lawn to mow for a 70-year-old who wants to go back to his rural place and live. And that might be me one day. And a lot of my homeless relations. It's a lot of land to mow. We would like to have smaller, close proximity housing. And so I have up on the PowerPoint here, I've asked your officials and thank them kindly for putting up some maps which would indicate close proximity housing. We have the traditional Whakarewarewa village. I am a landowner in there, and the traditional Ohinemutu village of Rotorua. I am also have interest in there, in the big house, Tamati Kapua. Now, they clearly indicate traditional close proximity housing. Now, I would like the council to just, the commissioners, please, in terms of urban and rural, those two words didn't exist when Aboriginal natives decided to set up camp and to build papakainga somewhere around a geothermal Nafa area where it was warm. So those two areas are geothermally active areas. The people were warm and they were in close proximity to each other. And even today, they might only be the thickness of a wall apart, the houses. There's no lawn between them, they're close. That's all really. That's my central issue. I don't want to take up any time. If you've got any questions for me, please fire away.
Thank you, Mr. Staten. And we have and I don't know if you've been listening in to these hearings, but we have been discussing the extent to which the Papakāinga provisions should be liberalised more. We haven't got there yet, but that's on our table. So, Tiffany, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, actually, I was just going to mention what the chair had, and it's certainly something we turned our minds to for the reasons that you've spoken to here, and we've been provided with information that so whānau don't have to go through what your whānau have been through. Can I just double check, because I heard things correctly, that your whānau had land in Te Paroa that they were unable to put a papakanga on?
Yes.
And then with the examples of Wāhine and Whakarewarewa, were you also a landowner in both of those villages?
Yes, my tupuna was a landowner. It was first to the lots, I should say.
Okay,
But I have interests there, traditional tribal interests, so I attend those places regularly, yes.
Yeah, kia ora. I just didn't want to write something down that it creates a nowhere for future generations.
I do live in another, which is referred to as a Māori village, although I didn't note it on the plan. It's supposed to be classified Māori village, Papakāinga, and that's Ngāpuna.
Yes, it is.
So I live at Ngāpuna.
Yeah, it is classified as a village.
Yes, okay then. So that's where I'm from. And my other name, a traditional tribe, my name is an Aboriginal native person, is Petera Pūwhenua Te Tuatoru ki tea I te ao marama. So that's my other name, and I that is my status. And I've notified those persons who I need to notify as to the status I hold, having represented my people in tribunals and the courts, and referring to Māori land courts and all the way through to Supreme Courts. I have to give you my status. So from time to time, I'd exercise my rights, provided me through Victoria as a British, the rights and privileges as a British subject, but I would swing back to my status as an Aboriginal native who has protected rights. So there are two, I say there are two. One's a latter-day creation. I'm not that. Well used, and very hard for me not to let it slip out of my mouth, the word Māori. But it doesn't apply to me when it comes to traditional rights that I claim. I hope you understand that. It's so important.
Ka tino marama.
Thank you very much. Did that take 10 minutes? No, it's okay.
All right, well, I guess if we're not sure whether Ms Davis is coming or not, so we will adjourn until Megan Hill's here, I suppose, at 1 o'clock. So we'll adjourn to 1 o'clock. Thank you. All right, let's adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow morning in that case. Thank you all very much.